printed in the leading medical journal, the BMJ. They published a peer review article in the last week by John Appleby. He's Director of Research at the Nuffield Trust. He knows what he's talking about. And he's shown that age standardised deaths last year were lower than every year before 2009. So we're not necessarily off the scale for a so-called desperately awful pandemic year. Well, let's talk to Dr. John Lee. He's a former NHS consultant in pathology. Good morning to you, John.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, let's just go into some detail of this. There's no doubt at all, huge numbers of people have died of COVID in the last year. And the figures we've got for 2020, of course, don't take into account the horrific death toll we saw in January and the first half of February as well. So no one is making light of these deaths or pretending that people have not died of COVID and that it's not a serious disease that needs to be dealt with. However, when we see these graphs showing these huge numbers of deaths, they're very often not placed in context. And I wanted you to try and help us with some of the context of this article. First of all, explain to us what age standardised deaths involve.
Well, just to backtrack a minute, when you say huge numbers of deaths, I think we do have to put those in context. This has become a soundbite that everybody's accepted, but it's actually not true. Huge is an emotive word, and huge means a vastly greater than normal number of deaths. Mm-hmm. And actually that isn't true. Even when you add together the two winter peaks, the total number of 128,000 should be compared to the 550,000 people who die every year in the UK. So I think we need to get these things, we really do need to get in context.
Okay, yeah, no, absolutely. I completely accept that context. Absolutely. But let's on the issue of the figures that John Appleby was looking at, age standardised deaths, because obviously, far more people will be dying this year than in, say, 1918 from the flu pandemic we had then, because of course we have vastly more people. So you have to adjust for population size. So it's per 100,000 or per million when we see these deaths. So actually give us an idea of, how many people would routinely die. But age standardised death also has an effect in terms of how you measure deaths, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the same sort of control, really. Basically, if the demographic of the country changes over time, which it does, we do have a larger number of older people now, you simply have to control for the number of people in each age group to actually work out what the death per that age group is, and then you can compare them together. I mean, what's interesting about this coming out now is it shows the lag really between, actually a sensible appreciation of reality catching up with reality. I mean, I and several others have been pointing out for almost a year that, in fact, 2020 ranked about 8th in the last 30 years of deaths. So, I mean, the point is this, in a way, this isn't news. The fact that it's published in a peer-reviewed journal is good, but it shows the time lag we're all suffering from. In the meantime, we've had a year taken out of our lives.
Yeah, and indeed, crucially, and I know you've looked closely at what's happened in Sweden as well, the country that didn't lock down famously had such a disaster because its death toll was so much greater than Norway and Denmark and Finland and its neighbouring Scandinavian countries. And yet their official figures, not a matter for dispute, when you look at excess deaths, so not a question of how you rate a death as COVID or not COVID, but overall, they have only seen something like 1.5% excess deaths across 2020 compared to higher excess deaths in many of the countries, including the UK, that did lock down. So really big question marks now that need to be raised about the policies that have been used.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, the top statistic for COVID for this country is that the average age of death for COVID, as I've said several times, in various places, but it doesn't get traction because the government is wedded to their own narrative and the opposition has forgotten to be an opposition. But the key statistic is that the average age of death for COVID is higher than the average age of death for all causes by 1 year. So in other words, if you look at everything that people are dying of, the average age of death is 81. If you look at the average age of death of COVID, it's 82, roughly. So the point is that what COVID has been doing is mainly killing elderly people with limited life expectancy. And the fact is that if there was a huge threat facing society that society was going to dissolve by if we didn't take massive action, like the plague, like smallpox, that's one thing. But, extraordinary measures should require extraordinary evidence. And the evidence is not there for COVID. However you cut it, COVID wasn't a threat that mandated that we did what we did.